At the end of the 19th century, the Phillies had one of the best outfields of all time. Ed Delahanty, Sam Thompson, Sliding Billy Hamilton, and all three of them made the Hall of Fame. Around the same time, the Phillies had such intimidating hitters as Nap Lajoie, Elmer Flick, and both of them made the Hall of Fame. From the 1930s, the Phillies are represented in the Hall by Chuck Klein. Then you have Robin Roberts, Jim Bunning, Richie Ashburn, Mike Schmidt, Steve Carlton. For most eras, the Phillies are well represented. But then you get to the early 20th century, from about 1901 through, say, 1928, which is when Chuck Klein joined the Phils. Sure, you've got Grover Cleveland Alexander and you've got Epper Rixey. Both of them, however, played quite a few years with other teams. You have Dave Bancroft, but he's in the Hall of Fame mostly for his time with the New York Giants. Bancroft's numbers for the Phillies aren't really that impressive. Really, there aren't that many great hitters from the early 20th century that made it to the Hall of Fame from the Phillies. Now, why is that? Well, stay tuned and we'll talk about it. Philadelphia Baseball History presents the dearth of early 20th century Phillies hitters in the Hall of Fame. When the American League was created in 1901, there's no question that the Phillies lost an awful lot of talent. Colonel Rogers was reportedly one of the worst and stingiest owners in baseball, and many of the Phillies players at the turn of the century couldn't wait to jump leagues and get paid more money. So were the Phillies that bad in the early part of the 20th century? Well, no, that can't be the answer. After all, the Phillies did win the National League pennant in 1915, and there were a number of decent hitters who played for the Phillies at the time. Consider Sherry Mcgee, a hot-headed left fielder who once knocked an umpire out cold over a disputed third strike. Mcgee spent 11 seasons with the Phillies, sporting a .299 batting average. He also hit 75 home runs and knocked in 886 RBIs, all during the dead ball era when he played with the Phils. In 1904, Mcgee set the single-season stolen base record for the Phils with 55. That's a record that stood for 80 years. In 1984, Juan Samuel came around and broke it by stealing 72 bases. In 1910, Mcgee led the National League in runs, RBIs, and batting average. In 1914, which was Mcgee's last year with the Phils, Mcgee led the National League in hits, RBIs, and slugging percentage. Mcgee was equally respected for his defense. He was known for spectacular catches and accurate throws from the outfield. In all respects, Sherry Mcgee was a quality outfielder. Yet, he hasn't gotten much serious consideration for the Hall of Fame. Gavi Griffith, who played alongside Mcgee in right field, was a consummate power hitter during the dead ball era. He held the 20th century record for career home runs, well, until a guy came along named George Herman Babe Ruth. Cravath led the National League in home runs 6 times. In 1913, Cravath led the National League in runs, RBIs, and slugging percentage. But his .341 batting average was only good enough for second place in the National League. His numbers for 1915 were solid, even for the dead ball era. He hit a major league leading 24 home runs with 115 RBIs. His slugging percentage also led the majors at .510. Cravath played a key role for the first Phillies team to win a pennant. Over his time as a Philly, Cravath amassed 117 home runs, 119 in his lifetime. His career Phillies batting average was .291. Lifetime, Cravath hit a respectable .287. There are players with less impressive stats than Gavi Griffith who are in the Hall of Fame. Even when you consider Chuck Klein with his .320 lifetime batting average and his 300 home runs, it took 36 years after his career ended and about 22 years after his death before he finally made it into the Hall of Fame. So what's been holding Phillies players back? Well, in short, and no pun intended, it was their home field, the Baker Bowl. Initially constructed in 1887 and then reconstructed in 1895, the Baker Bowl fits snugly within a single city block. It was bordered by Broad and 15th Street, Lehigh Avenue, and Huntington Street. When it was reconstructed in 1895, it was the first stadium to boast a cantilevered upper deck. It was also the first baseball arena to use concrete and steel. But while at the time it was praised for being state-of-the-art, it was still crammed into a single block in an urban area. Its dimensions were, shall we say, generous to hitters. Let's take Fenway Park, for example. Fenway is known for having the Green Monster in left field. The Green Monster is a 37-foot high wall out in left field. Along the foul line, it's 310 feet away from home plate, and in left center, it's about 379 feet. The wall was built essentially to protect against cheap line drive home runs that were hit to left field. Interestingly, Fenway also boasts the shortest right field fence in modern baseball. The right field fence stands a mere 302 feet away from home plate, but it juts out in deep right to about 380 feet. Like the Baker Bowl, Fenway Park was crammed into a single city block in a dense urban area of an East Coast metropolis. Now let's consider the Baker Bowl's dimensions. From its opening until about 1921, the right field fence stood at about 271 feet. The dimensions were widened to 279 feet in 1922 and then 280 feet in 1927. Right center stood at about 300 feet. There was a 40-foot wall in right field, again to protect against the cheap line drive home runs. In 1915, the Phillies constructed a 20-foot screen to sit on top of the 40-foot wall so that a pop fly had to go over 60 feet in right field in order to be a home run. National League sluggers who played in Philadelphia for most of their career, therefore, had their numbers discounted because of the dimensions of their home park. But let's take a look at the numbers of these three hitters. In particular, we're looking at the distribution of home runs between their home park and when they played on the road. For Chuck Klein, there was no real great difference between the amount of home runs he hit at home and the amount of home runs he hit on the road. Over his career, Klein hit 190 home runs in his home park. That included a short stint in Chicago and Pittsburgh. This meant that he hit 110 home runs on the road. When you look specifically at the home runs hit at the Baker Bowl, Klein hit 164 home runs there, whereas 136 home runs were hit in all the other ballparks. This means that only 55% of Klein's home runs were hit in the Baker Bowl. Plus, by the time Klein started playing, which was in 1928, the Baker Bowl had reached its largest dimensions in right field. So while it took a while for Cooperstown to recognize it, playing in the Baker Bowl really did not distort Chuck Klein's numbers that much. So now let's look at Sherry Mcgee. Sherry Mcgee hit 75 home runs as a Philly, but 84 over his career. Of his career home runs, 43 were hit in the Baker Bowl. So only about 51% of Mcgee's home runs were hit in Philadelphia. That means Mcgee's career home runs are about evenly split between hitting them at home and hitting them on the road. Like Klein, Mcgee's Hall of Fame consideration shouldn't be diminished because of the amount of time he spent playing in the Baker Bowl. Now, of Gavi Cravath's 119 career home runs, a full 77% of them were hit in the Baker Bowl. Cravath clearly benefited from the short right field porch. Cravath's candidacy for the Hall of Fame has also been plagued by his relatively short career in the major leagues. On the other hand, Cravath did suffer from an East Coast bias. Cravath was born in California and played a significant number of years in the Pacific Coast League. And while a number of quality players came from the Pacific Coast League, it's not considered a major league. Nonetheless, despite some high-quality hitters who played for the Phillies in the early 20th century, those players are handicapped for Hall of Fame consideration because of the dimensions of their home park. But as mentioned above, Sherry Mcgee's candidacy for the Hall of Fame really shouldn't be discounted because of the time he spent in the Baker Bowl because of his equal distribution between home and road home runs. So currently, when it comes to inducting a player who is not voted in by the Baseball Writers Association of America, the Hall of Fame utilizes a system called the ERAS Committee, E-R-A-S. This replaced the old Veterans Committee. Basically, baseball is divided into 3 time periods, and each time period is represented by a separate committee. The Early Baseball Committee, which considers players who made their major contributions before 1950, will sit again in the winter of 2020. After that, the current Hall of Fame's policy is to have the Early Baseball Committee meet once every decade. And the Hall of Fame is pushing to have more contemporary players considered for induction rather than old-time players. In fact, you would have to go back to the turn of the millennium, around 1999-2000, for the last time that a player who was not a Negro League player, who made most of his major contributions between, say, 1900 and 1920, who was chosen for induction into the Hall of Fame. Interestingly, the Golden Era Committee, which considers players who made their contributions between 1950 and 1969, will also meet again this winter. That means that 3 players who made their major contributions while playing in Philadelphia could possibly be considered for the Hall of Fame this winter. Mcgee could be considered by the Early Baseball Committee, And of course, among the fan base, there's a large push to have Dick Allen considered for Hall of Fame induction by the Golden Era Committee. Harry Tovey, who played for the Philadelphia Athletics of the American Association, not the American League, the American Association, which was a major league that competed with the National League at the end of the 19th century, could be considered by the early baseball committee as well. It should be interesting to see whether this winter Sherry Mcgee gets another shot at being inducted into the Hall of Fame. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. If you have any ideas for topics that we can cover in the future, please let us know in the comments below. We have new t-shirt designs, including the Philadelphia Athletics and Harry Tovey of the American Association. And don't forget to show your pride as you protect your health and that of your family. We now have masks available in our merch store. We'll have a link in the description box below. If you would like to see more of these videos, please consider becoming a patron through Patreon. Again, we'll have a link in the description box below.